I'd like to introduce now our keynote speaker. Congressman Mike Gallagher was first elected in 2016. He represents Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. As you know, that's also where Meredith Marine is located. He is a 7th generation Wisconsin native, born and raised in Green Bay. Congressman Gallagher joined the United States Marine Corps the day after he graduated from college and served for 7 years on active duty as a counterintelligence, human intelligence officer, and regional affairs officer for the Middle East, North Africa, eventually earning the rank of captain. He deployed twice to El Anbar province, Iraq, as a commander of intelligence teams, served on General Petraeus' Central Command Assessment Team in the Middle East, and worked for 3 years in the intelligence community, including tours at the National Counterterrorism Center and the Drug Enforcement Agency. Congressman Gallagher also served as the lead Republican staffer for Middle East, North Africa, and counterterrorism on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to taking office, he worked in the private sector at a global energy and supply chain management company in Green Bay. After earning his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, Congressman Gallagher went on to earn a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University, a second in strategic intelligence from National Intelligence University, and his PhD in international relations from Georgetown. He currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, where he's a member of the Sea Power and Projection Forces, as well as the Readiness Subcommittees. He also serves on the Homeland Security Committee, where he's a member of the Counterterrorism and Intelligence and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittees. Welcome, Congressman. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to
Chair. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Does that work?
got it. Good.
All right. Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you for that. I'm honored to be here, and it's a great way to start our legislative week. And to the American Society of Naval Engineers, thank you for having me. Thank you for putting this together. I'm looking forward to sharing my perspective and then hearing from you in the Q&A session. I have to say, though, it's more than a little intimidating to sit in a room of engineers as someone who is not from that academic background, and moreover, as a Marine. I'd appreciate it if you could just keep it to less than 3-syllable words in the Q&A. That'd be very helpful for me. I was also part of a generation of Marines that deployed to fight land wars and didn't spend much time on ships. And I remember whenever we were in Western Iraq, I had a Lance Corporal. We would constantly be getting these messages from the Commandant saying we needed to rediscover our amphibious roots. And my Lance Corporal would look around at the desert and say, "There's no water here, sir. How are we going to rediscover our amphibious roots?" But it's an honor to serve on the Sea Power subcommittee where we're looking at a variety of issues, including the health of our defense industrial base. And I'd say our national security technology base is one of our first lines of defense against foreign aggression. And I could not be more proud to represent the hardworking men and women of Marinette Marine in Congress, as well as the Green Bay Packers in Congress, who had a great overtime victory 2 days ago. I'm fortunate each and every day to witness the dedication of the men and women that walk through that shipyard and just try and solve problems and make a great ship for the Navy and help our sailors accomplish the mission and come home safe. And while our defense labor force is second to none, our Navy as a whole is facing serious and growing challenges. And around the globe, near-peer adversaries are making large investments in their naval forces that are eroding the margins of American military superiority. This theme was hammered home by CNO Richardson in his Future Navy White Paper earlier this year. As the CNO put it, both China and Russia are challenging U.S. influence and interest in expanding areas of the world, often in maritime spaces. They have been very explicit about their maritime intentions and have moved out smartly to advance them. In 2016 alone, the PLN Navy commissioned 18 ships, and these are increasingly advanced ships, including guided missile destroyer, 3 guided missile frigates, and 6 corvettes. These 18 ships have a total displacement of 150,000 tons, about half that of the entire British Royal Navy. And I would submit to you, yes, sure, the average American sailor is far better trained than your average Chinese sailor, and most American ships enjoy real qualitative advantages over their Chinese counterparts. But at a certain point, as you all know, as the old adage goes, quantity has a quality all its own. And China has the largest navy in the Pacific with over 300 ships. For instance, under the Navy's 2017 shipbuilding plan, and I know this is subject to change, but this is our current baseline, we are on track to have 41 submarines by 2029. At current production rates, the Chinese would have at least 70 by then. So I would submit that in light of these threats, it's no surprise that growing the fleet to 355 ships is a widespread and bipartisan goal. Yet, unfortunately, and granted I've only been here 11 months in Congress, so I've just sort of figured out where all the buildings are, and I still get stopped because people think I look like a staffer, so they don't want to let me into any of the members' meetings. But I would be lying to you if I didn't say that I had growing concerns that we will get there. After all, I was rereading John Lehman's autobiography the other day, and it's remarkable that getting to a 600-ship Navy or a 594, 96-ship Navy, engineers, you guys are going to check me on my math on all this. It didn't appear out of thin air. I mean, you read that bio, and what you come away with is just a sense for what it took to bend the bureaucracy to the goal of a 600-ship Navy. It took a personal, everyday commitment by the Secretary of the Navy, backed by the clear guidance of the President of the United States. And even there, it was extraordinarily difficult to make happen. It was not easy. As he later reflected, by the end of Reagan's administration's second year, the defense bureaucracy had reasserted its hold over the policy process. He ultimately succeeded, but it took personal leadership and single-minded work ethic every day in service of the 600-ship Navy, and I think the country was better off and more safe as a result. So I'm glad that we finally have a Secretary of the Navy who's confirmed, and I'm glad that in his confirmation hearing, Secretary Spencer rightly spoke about creative levers the Navy could pull to get to 355, including possibly bringing ships out of the ready reserve, and I'd be interested in hearing from you on your thoughts on that proposal. Yet I'll be honest, I was disappointed to see that growing the fleet did not appear to be a priority in the mission, vision, and priorities document that was released a month ago. I believe Secretary Spencer has correctly called for a sense of urgency throughout the Navy, yet this sense of urgency must extend to growing the fleet as quickly as practical. It also must extend to Congress, to ending defense sequester and the BCA in order to give the Navy the resources it needs to grow the fleet as quickly as is practical and possible. Every day, month, and budget year that goes by without significant progress towards 355 makes this urgent requirement that much less likely to materialize. And I would just submit, and I tried to explain this in my home newspaper the other day, the Green Bay Press Gazette, where, let's face it, a lot of people are focused on Packers news. Or I remember my announcement for Congress was overshadowed on the front page by a story about Aaron Rodgers photobombing at the Oscars. So that gives you a sense of kind of the priorities oftentimes. And it's hard to make the case for 355. And often these numbers, they seem arbitrary or some bumper sticker campaign. But it's not arbitrary. It's not a bumper sticker campaign promise. I would submit to you there's nothing arbitrary about the Navy's requirement for more ships, nor optional about America's role in the world and on the high seas. And I don't need to tell this room, but it's not just that 90% of global trade travels by sea, or that 40% of the world's population lives within 62 miles of the coast, or even in an internet age, our global economy is still ocean-bound with 99% of our intercontinental telecommunications dependent on fiber optic cables at the bottom of the sea. It's that history teaches us what happens in one ocean far away can have direct impact on our lives here at home. And when foreign aggression does happen, our forces must be able to travel on or over the world's oceans to reach the conflict. And it can be easy in the internet age to gloss over the simple geographic reality. Our adversaries are continental powers whose borders touch zones of potential conflicts. When conflict erupts, they have ready lines of supply and communication stretching back into their hinterlands. In contrast, in order to support our allies and defend our forward positions, the bulk of American forces face long and potentially dangerous journeys just to get to the fight. This means that our entire defense posture is predicated on our command of the seas and the skies above them. And while we can afford rough parity with our strategic competitors in other domains, I believe our maritime superiority must be absolutely unquestioned. And this is ultimately what getting to 355 is all about. Meeting combatant commander demand for naval presence around the world in order to ensure maritime superiority and the viability of our defense strategy. Unfortunately, we are today seeing the tragic consequences of our inability to keep pace with growing demands. With 4 significant shipboard accidents in Asia in 2017, we owe it to the sailors of both today and tomorrow to get to the bottom of the systemic problems that may have underpinned these tragedies. Evidence from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, suggests that more than a third of cruiser and destroyer crews forward deployed in Japan had at least one lapsed certification, a 5-fold increase since 2015. Declining readiness amongst forward deployed naval forces is manifesting in all too real and tragic ways. More ships are needed to lessen the burden on our forward assets, which are being taxed to their limits by demanding operational tempo. At the same time, more ships aren't the only solution. As this crowd knows all too well, ships are nothing without the proper maintenance and training that they need to survive, and a crew that is properly trained and ready to accomplish the mission. So as we reinforce our forward deployed naval assets, we also need to make sure we are surging our forward deployed maintenance and training infrastructure to meet growing demand. We also need to ensure that our forward deployed forces receive priority for filling vital billets. The tragic deaths of 17 sailors this summer should not be in vain, and it need not be in vain. They stand as a very real and a very tragic testament to the declining readiness across our force. We in Congress need to do our job to support you and to pass a long-term budget deal that ends 6 years of catastrophic budget cuts. Continuing resolutions and short-term fixes will not do it. We cannot put Band-Aids on bullet wounds. The good news is there's broad agreement on what needs to be done. Most Republicans and Democrats, I believe, at least in the Armed Services Committee, are on the same page that we need to provide more resources for our military. What we can't agree on is how to pay for this, or what a long-term budget deal would look like exactly. Or we somehow can't seem to muster up the courage just to get it done. Get this done, our first and foremost constitutional responsibility before we have a debate about all the other issues like health care and tax reform and everything else that's important. But it means nothing if we're not able to keep the country safe. I'm agnostic on the specific components of a deal. I'm willing to listen to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to find a solution that works. But call me an idealist or maybe just a freshman member of Congress, but I genuinely believe, given the urgency for change, we can put partisanship aside and do what's right for the country we love. Anything less is a dereliction of duty and unworthy of our men and women in uniform. And so on behalf of someone who spends most of his days in Congress thinking about the future of the Navy and the Marine Corps, and more broadly the future of our military, on behalf of someone who had the distinct honor and privilege of leading Marines in a combat zone, I want to thank you for the work that you do. I want to thank you for being here. The work you do saves lives. It helps us accomplish the mission, and it helps us keep the country safe. And I can think of no higher calling, and I can think of no better cause that can unite this country in an otherwise divided time. So thank you. It's an honor to be with you. I'm happy to take any questions you have. And just remember, I got a C+ in introductory economics, so technological questions may be very difficult for me. Sir.
Anderson, U.S. Coast Guard. I'm just kind of curious, to get to your 355, how many more sailors do you think you'll need, and how do you have a plan on it? You didn't discuss.
Yeah, that's a great question.
You have a plan with that?
There hasn't been a lot of talk in Congress about the specific number. We know we'll need a lot more, and that will require a lot more resources. But we've used 355 as a heuristic to suggest that if we accomplish that, this means that we're growing the force more broadly in the right direction. You know, for the ship that I spent a lot of time thinking about, the littoral combat ship, and hopefully will ultimately become the frigate, there's an ongoing debate about how many sailors we need to put on that ship. And I think we can start to get creative, but at the end of the day, no matter how creative you get, it's just going to require a lot more assets and resources. And we're also going to have to start thinking about retention in the Navy, which the picture looks pretty bleak right now, at least as I look at it. And why is that? There's a dearth, I believe, of surface warfare officers at the highest levels of the Navy. Perhaps we're seeing a lack of basic seamanship as a result. I don't know. It's too early to judge the source of these accidents, and I don't want to prejudge. I don't want to read the Navy's final conclusions, but this is something that came up in the hearing that we had a couple weeks ago. So I don't have a precise number for you, but to the point of your question, it's going to require a lot more sailors. And I'll admit that's something that we haven't spent as much time on in Congress. We've just been talking about the overall ship number. We've also been talking about what the mix of those ships looks like, right? I still think there's going to be a need for small surface combatants, and I don't just say that as a proponent of the LCS, but you just look at the geography of the Pacific, and there's certain ports that destroyers can't get into. I also think there's an opportunity to really leverage unmanned systems, and it's pretty exciting when you start to dig into that technology and how you might be able to use it, both for ISR and for kinetic activities as well. So I just would say to you honestly, there's a lot of lip service being paid to the need to rebuild the Navy, but there's not a lot of urgency right now. And you look at the most ambitious projections. CBO did an analysis of how long it could take us to get to 355 ships. And I think the soonest they said was 18 years. Is that right? I mean, I get it. Our defense industrial base is very fragile right now. And I think if the president stood up there and said, I want 355 ships in less than a decade, there would be very real questions about whether we could even deliver that. But we should be having that discussion, right? Because I'm worried that 18 years is too late. I'm worried about what the world would look like 18 years from now, and that's an inadequate number. And so I think we also need to take a look at the health of our defense industrial base and the fragility of our supply chains and see if indeed we wanted to get there in a shorter period of time, could we even do it? So if you guys could figure that out in the next 48 hours and come back to me, I'd be happy to take credit for it. Sir.
Dave Helverson, I'm curious about your view of strategic sea lift and the U.S. merchant marine contribution to our defense needs.
Yeah, I don't have very sophisticated views on it, to be honest. It is another thing that often gets overlooked, and no one really is thinking about how that fits into the broader mission set for the Navy. But I think we have the same problems that we're seeing in the Navy more broadly, right? With real questions about capabilities, assets, training, and the ability to meet the demands that Sealift is asked to do. So beyond that, it's something that hasn't received a lot of attention. Apologize. Sir.
Rich Wiseman.
Yeah.
Congressman, following on the earlier question about manning, beyond looking at what's going on in land systems and the rather progressive incorporation of unmanned systems on our land systems,
Sure.
and a number of programs of record that are out there already, going beyond simple ISR to the fundamental design of the platforms for the future, incorporate reduced manning. Could you comment on that? CVN 78, for instance,
Sure.
already enjoys a significant reduction in manning, and that was designed in the beginning.
I think the promise is there, and I think it opens up real opportunities to achieve efficiencies on manning, but it also creates a logistical trail in order to keep, that requires human beings in order to keep those systems operational. Now, those human beings may not be on ships, right? But they still cost money, or they may not even be in uniform, they may be contractors, but there's still a whole tail that entails to keep those systems in operation. So I'm all for creatively leveraging unmanned systems and thereby reducing the actual number of people that we need on ships, but we're still gonna need a lot of people to keep these systems up to date and to keep pace with our near-peer adversaries. It's interesting. I'd be interested in your guys' thoughts about, it seems like we've been talking about the third offset for a decade now. And I say this as someone who spent a lot of time studying the early Cold War and the first offset and the second offset. I just think, in contrast to that moment, our adversary's ability to catch up with our technology, or in some ways outpace it. The head of Army Cyber Command a month ago said, we are already outgunned in cyberspace. So this isn't a matter of China and Russia catching up to us in the short term. They've already caught up and surpassed us. So in contrast to previous days where nuclear weapons and precision-guided munitions could buy us a distinct advantage that compensated for our inferiority in conventional forces, I'm just not convinced that a third offset, whatever it is, whether it's AI mixed with cyber and unmanned systems, whatever that looks like, is going to be able to give us that advantage for a sustained period of time, given the pace with which our adversaries could catch up. And I think in that environment of technological parity, although I think we're always going to want to maintain a technical edge, we're going to actually just have to have more ships and human beings and presence around the world. That's sort of my unsophisticated strategic take on where we are. So I just think there will never come a moment at which unmanned systems can totally reduce the need for human beings on ships, being forward deployed, working with our allies, and solving problems, if that makes sense.
Sir.
Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned autonomous systems and
Yeah.
cyber and all that. And underlying all of that is software.
Yeah.
And if you go to the Pentagon and you start talking about software, they say, we don't buy software. We only buy systems. And the fact is, the development of software is a very fragile enterprise. Okay? And you need to pay more attention when we start talking about building cyber systems and autonomous systems and all that. That we need to drastically improve how we build software.
Yeah.
And if you don't, all these grand visions of what you can do with these systems is going to end up in a crash.
Yeah, let me talk about kind of not directly related. So I agree with your point. I'm sure you've all heard the latest theory. It's captured the imagination of conspiracy theorists on Capitol Hill, which is to say that these accidents are the result of a cyber attack or someone hacking the commercial vessel and steering it into a Navy ship, which is entirely possible. You'd like to think, though, that even in that scenario, the Fitzgerald and the McCain would have been able to avoid a collision. So I'm not ruling it out, and again, we'll see what happens. But I do think more likely it's just the fact that we've placed stress on the force, and that's what's causing these. But if you look more broadly at our ability to not only field the best technology through an acquisitions process that I think we would all agree is cumbersome at best and perhaps broken at worst, particularly difficult for up-and-coming small and mid-sized defense firms. I was just out in Boston looking at a couple of robotics companies and talking with them about the challenges they face, and just because it's not easy, it's impossible for them to weather the ups and downs of the DoD budget process and the lack of clarity regarding whether or not they're going to be given a contract, in contrast to Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop, who can weather those ups and downs. And as a result, some of the most innovative companies and ideas aren't even getting a chance to play in the game. And I think that's even more exaggerated on the software side of the equation. More broadly, I have concerns about when it comes to software and cyberspace. I have concerns about the way in which each service is trying to train the next generation of professionals and warriors. And so, again, my bias as a knuckle-dragging Marine. If the Marine Corps wants to take that 20-year-old Lance Corporal who's demonstrated him or herself, train him into being a world-class cyber operator, send him to Mar 4 Cyber, and do good things on behalf of the country, that's great. I, however, am not convinced that 18, 19, 20-year-old Lance Corporal who rogered up to get a high tight, run around, beat his chest, do some pull-ups, is always going to be the same as the world-class 16, 17-year-old cyber hacker, right? Whose talents we want to harness for good, right? And who may not want to get a high and tight and run around and beat his chest and do pull-ups. And also, if we take the time to train these young kids to make them world-class, we've made them so, we can't force them to have a 20-year payback requirement. We've made them so valuable to the private sector that we're going to lose them, right? And maybe we can get more creative with how we harness private sector actors. Maybe we can evolve in such a way where we have something akin to what the Estonians do with their Cyber Defense League. I don't know. I'm all for it. But I suspect we need to even get more creative with how we harness the best talent in that space. And I would be open to something as, to having a debate about whether we need a separate academy entirely with a more flexible model. that we station at DUIX and we do in partnership with Silicon Valley. And we have a higher pay scale, and we have a different payback requirement, and we have different grooming standards, and all of that to recruit the best and the brightest in that space, because I'm just not convinced that we're doing it right now. We're not keeping up.
And just to say your point about the acquisition system is entirely true. Software.
Yeah. So we've tried to do some stuff through the last NDA with commercial off-the-shelf technology, and Chairman Thornberry is very committed to being aggressive when it comes to acquisition reform, but it's difficult. It is really difficult. And it takes people in the administration that are willing to wade into that mess and try and simplify it. And let's be honest, I mean, right now, it's not just at DOD, it's at state, it's at all these agencies. We still don't have people in place. At the assistant secretary level, some deputy secretaries, I mean, it's been very slow. And it's been very hard, and you saw it in this budget process where you had a group of us in Congress that were trying to make the case for a higher top line number, 641, 631, whatever you want to call it, and the number we got from OMB was 603, which was a modest increase over the last administration's request, and it was trying to be sold to us as a huge defense increase, and it simply wasn't the case. And so we're just going to need more urgency, and people are going to have to make the case. It's hard, and I get it. It's hard. Back in Northeast Wisconsin, people always countered to me, well, you know, we're spending so much money in the Defense Department and they waste money. And I get it. I've seen it up close, right? We bribed Afghan poppy farmers to the tune of $13 billion, and the next year they set the record for opium planted, right? I personally had a wad of cash that I was able to use to get information, right? I mean, that was probably more valuable than some other ways. But the biggest way we waste money is through an inefficient stop-start budgeting process that doesn't allow the Pentagon to plan for the long term. And an inefficient acquisition process that costs billions of dollars. Yeah. Sure.
I'm Adrian McKenna from the Navy at Carteret. When you look at the 355 ship plan, the increase in the ships are mostly in the larger types of ships, like destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. So when you look at how much it would cost to procure that fleet, it would be significantly more shipbuilding budget. What do you think the probability is of getting those additional funds to execute the Navy's plan?
If we continue on the current course we've been on in Congress, the probability is very low. The fact that we're still living under the destructive demands of the BCA is shocking to me. And I know it sounds naive as a new member of Congress, but that was the whole reason I won. I mean, that I ran, was just seeing what was happening in the world and what we've done to our own military. And there's a lot of people in Congress that say the same things, but for whatever reason, those, let's call them defense hawks, haven't been able to organize in the same way that the fiscal hawks have. And even as evidence accumulates that we've created a vacuum and we've created an opportunity for our adversaries and we've forced our military into very difficult situations, it doesn't seem like we can just muster up the courage to do it. So very low, but I don't know. I just would say that we don't have an option for failure. And I understand the need we want to build more destroyers and subs, but we confront this debate with the LCS and some of our smaller ships, right? And granted, I concede the program has had many problems, but go talk to the guys out of PACOM. They got an Independence class out there right now. They put a harpoon on it, and they love the capability that it brings to the fight. And so we always get to this point of, you know, the last administration was trying to force us to choose between posture and presence and whether we wanted to have exquisitely hardened and equipped ships or just perhaps less capable ships that are present and capable of doing a more limited set of things. And so we need to have a mix, right? We need to have a mix of the smaller end, smaller ships, while still adequately funding the bigger ships. And it's troubling to me that at a time when we have a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, which seems to get worse every day, that now we have 2 Aegis-class destroyers that are out of commission. And the capability that they would bring to that problem is significant. And we don't have the ability to fill that gap right now, which just shows how fragile the fleet is right now.
So we've had one more question.
Sure. Sure.
Like you can say a particular ship, as the Arctic becomes more navigable, I think you've got a pretty sparse icebreaker.
Yeah.
Do
Did Duncan Hunter plant this question for you? So I think it's a great point. I will say in the climate change debate, Secretary Mattis said, listen, we just got new sea lanes in the Arctic. I don't know why they're there, but they're there. So I have to deal with it, which I was taken by. And I think we ignore the Arctic at our peril, and obviously we know Russia wants to exploit that region, and there's enormous natural resources. I forget the exact stats on natural gas, but also other rare earth minerals that are essential. It's just a question of how we fund the Icebreaker, like everything else. We all know we need more. We all know that our ability to build these things has gone down, along with the decline in commercial shipbuilding in general over the last few decades. But the Icebreaker often gets ignored when we talk about funding the bigger ships and the mid-sized ships. So I don't have a good answer for you on how we get there. Duncan Hunter has some thoughts about requiring more parts of the Navy budget to be devoted to the Icebreaker. I'm not sure a lot of us on Sea Power are there right now, but we know it's a problem we need to fix at the end of the day. So I wish I had a more optimistic message for everybody. I will say this in closing. As frustrating as Washington, D.C. can be at times, and I can only imagine what it looks like from your perspective when you're waking up every day and just trying to do your job and do the right thing. You see a bunch of politicians who just want to argue and tear each other apart. I said on the radio the other day that football was the last thing I had in my life that wasn't politicized until this last week. I will say the newer members of Congress, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the old, but I've just been genuinely impressed by my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the freshman class. And at least in the initial going, there's been a sense of politics as usual isn't working for anybody, it's certainly not working for the U.S. military right now. We got to find a better way of doing business. And maybe that happens every 2 years, and maybe people regress to the mean and we get locked into more intransigence and vitriol. But I got to believe that, particularly in the present moment, we could come together and start fixing some problems. I know there's a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle committed to doing just that. So thank you guys for what you do. I really appreciate it.